How often do you recall reading the scriptures when the children of Israel would stray? God would invariably come to them, and the first words out of his mouth were, remember. In Isaiah chapter 46, God is speaking to the children of Israel, and this is what he says. Remember the former things, those of long ago. I am God, and there is no other. I am God, and there is none like me. I make known the end from the beginning, from ancient times, what is still to come. I say my purpose will stand, and I will do all that I please. From the east I summon a bird of prey, from a far-off land, a man, to fulfill my purpose. What I have said, that will I bring about. What I have planned, that will I do. This is one of those verses that threw me into a large cocoon. It could well be one of the largest cocoons I've ever been in. But it was wrestling with this issue that God appears in his word to us as one who is in control. The word is sovereign. And I think one of the reasons I had so much trouble with that, and the reason the cocoon was so long, was not because I didn't understand what was being said to me as I was gazing upon the face of God, but what it revealed in me. And the reason I had trouble with this was primarily that I was so full of pride and so full of a desire to be in control myself that it was very difficult for me to wrestle with the reality that God is the one who was in ultimate control. And so here we read in Isaiah 46 that God is saying that he is the one who is fulfilling his purpose. And he is carrying out a plan. What I have planned, that will I do. Well, that plan is what we're going to talk about today. And it is a plan that comes to a fulfillment when we read in Galatians chapter 4. Listen to this. When the fullness of the time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, that we might receive the adoption as sons. Remember when we were talking about the answer to the question, who is man? And we had to understand that man has gone through various states. And in that state where we were fallen, we had no way out of that state except to die. And that left us in an eternal state, separated from God forever and ever. But the plan of God, already in place, beginning in the garden from the time of the fall, the very beginnings of that plan were revealed, and they were revealed throughout the scripture until we get to the point where the scripture now says in Galatians 4, when the time was right, God acted. Now, it's not as if he hadn't been acting throughout that entire time, but at this moment, that grand moment when God then acted in time and space, became a man to redeem those who were lost. Well, this brings us face to face with a God who is in charge. And what we're going to have to wrestle with today is whether or not we really want him to be in charge. So we're going to take a look at this plan of God and the promise of God fulfilled and how it now relates to where we are about to head. Would you like to know where? Yes. Good, because we are going to head now northwest, and we're going to build the final pillar, history. But first of all, I need to begin with a little test, because I need for you to be alert and ready, and I want to make sure that before we start this tour that we're just all kind of on the same page. So I want to start with a little exam. Okay, it's not a tricky exam. I'm not trying to spoof you. I just want to make sure that we're all together here. Okay, let's begin with this. Jay, what is that?
Looks like a time.
Looks like a time, and it is. I'm not trying to trick you. It is. 8:59. We're a little past 8:59 this morning, but that's exactly right. It is a time. Now, let me change this just slightly. What is that? David, what is that?
Date.
A date, a year. That's exactly right. Is there anything significant about that year? 1859. Anyone know anything significant about this year? Willie, do you?
Civil.
101 years later, I was born.
Oh, well, then that makes it very significant. This is a very significant date, by the way. Let me pause in the middle of our exam to make sure you recognize that there is something significant about this date. It's the only date I require my seminary students to memorize. It is the year that the Origin of Species was written.
Ooh.
A huge milestone, not only in the life of this nation, but in the life of the world. 1859, it is a date, you're exactly right. Okay, but that was just the warm-up exam. Now we're ready for the big one. What is that?
Number one.
One, that's exactly right. Jason, did you see that as a one?
Yes, sir.
How do you know that that's a one?
English class when I was very small.
Okay, that's fine. Somewhere in your past, you were taught that when you see a symbol that looks similar to that, you recognize that as a numeric one.
Right.
That's right, that's good. And I suppose you all saw it that way. Okay, so what is this?
11.
11. Lena, did you see that as 11? That's good. I'm very impressed. I'm proud. How do you know that that's an 11?
I was taught that.
You were taught that. Somewhere in your past, you were taught that when you see those digits together, because you didn't see that as a 1-1, did you?
No, I didn't.
No, you saw that as 11. In close proximity, you know that's the tens unit, that's the ones unit, that's 11. Very good. What is this?
911.
911. Now that's strange, is it not? Because when I was in school, if the teacher had put that up on the board and anyone in the class, Grant, had said 911, we'd all turned and laughed at them. Why? Because to us, that's 911. But in our culture today, I guarantee you, if you saw that on a billboard, no one would look at that and say, I wonder why somebody put 911 up on a billboard. No, because we see that primarily as an emergency number, do we not? That's exactly right. How in the world does all of a sudden a culture go from 911 to 911? We have been taught. And now those numbers mean something different, do they not? Here is the point. Because we're going to be talking about history, we're going to be talking about the past, and to some extent we're talking about the issue of time. We'd have to take a longer tour to talk about all of the elements of time. We're going to concentrate primarily on the issue of history today, but let's get our definition straight. What is the difference between the past and the future? What is the definition of the past, Carolyn?
Events that happened before.
Okay, events that already happened. That's right. I'm not trying to trick you. Events that already happened. What is the future?
Events in
Events that haven't yet happened. What is the definition of the present?
Events that are happening.
No.
Yeah, this is what's happening now. Right now. Now, am I asking you the definition of the past right now, in the present?
No.
No, that's already in the past. Am I asking you the definition of the future right now?
No, but
No, that's in the past as well. And so is that statement. And that one. And that one. The present is a very thin nanosecond line sliding along, converting the future into the past. Now, the reason that's important for us to keep in mind is a principle that I would like for you to ponder for a minute. What you believe in the present is determined by the past. It's not some new age kind of a thing. I'm just saying what you believe in the present is determined by the past. You don't look up on that board and instantly, out of nowhere, say, oh, that's a 1. Ex nihilo, out of nothing, you know that's a 1. No, you know that's a 1. You understand what it means because of the past. It may help us to understand why God continues to come to his people and say, remember. Now, this leads us to recognize and begin to understand that if that principle is true, we might expect that this thing called history now becomes extremely critical and extremely important. Let me give you an example. I don't know how many of you have ever read a book called I, Rigoberta Menchú, an Indian woman in Guatemala. Has anyone read the book? Have you heard of the book? Okay. Not surprising, it used to be that many students would raise their hand and say they've read the book, and that is because for many years this book was on the required reading list in universities. It has now moved from the required reading list to the recommended reading list, and every college student knows that no college student reads anything on the recommended reading list. It's an interesting book. It is an autobiography written by Rigoberta Menchú. She is writing, giving an account, growing up in Guatemala, having been oppressed because she was a woman. The book is what I would call a fairly left-leaning book, leans towards Marxism, fairly radical towards feminism. And she won the Nobel Prize for this book in the early 1990s. Well, then something interesting happened. There was a young man by the name of David Stoll who was doing his doctoral work in Guatemala, and he found himself in a village where he recalled, having read her book, that this was the village in which he recalled her writing about her brother being tortured and burned to death. And so he began to ask some of the villagers questions about that event, and he got blank stares. So he pressed further, and they began to say, no one has ever been tortured or burned to death here. So he began to investigate further. Ended up writing a book himself, claiming that the book is a fraud. She was not a peasant woman who was not allowed to go to school. Actually, her father was a landowner. She went to a private school. Well, there's a controversy that began to rage over this book, but that's not quite the point I'm wanting to make. Here's the point. A professor, in the midst of this controversy and reading the evidence that David Stoll had now raised, and to a great extent been substantiated, makes the statement. She says, whether her book is true, I don't care. What is important is that we teach our students about the brutality of the Guatemalan military, the horrors of capitalism, and so forth. Now, what is that professor's position on history?
It could be rewritten.
It can be rewritten?
For your own purpose.
For your own purpose, which is what?
To get people to believe whatever you're wanting them to believe.
To get someone to believe in the present, whatever you want them to believe. Now, think about this. If the principle we talked about is true, why should I spend the time and effort and energy in the present laying out the pros and the cons, trying to convince someone of a particular position, when all I have to do is fiddle with the past and make you believe what I want in the present? Do you follow what I'm saying? Well, let's look at another example for a minute. Let's look at the Mayflower Compact. We whose names are underwritten, he said, having undertaken a voyage to plant the first colony. Well, let's examine that for a second. Is that really what the Mayflower Compact says? We whose names are underwritten, having undertaken a voyage to plant the first colony. That's similar to what you will probably find in a schoolhouse today. But something has been deleted from it. Let's look at it. In the name of God, amen. We whose names are underwritten, having undertaken for the glory of God and the advancement of the Christian faith, a voyage to plant the first colony. What's missing? God is missing. And their purpose for coming is missing. Why did they come? For the glory of God, the advancement of the Christian faith. Now, does it matter if you just simply take a few words out of history? Are you really rewriting it? You're just leaving a few things out. Does that have any effect on a child who's now reading about the Pilgrims? That you just simply extract anything about God or their purpose for coming if it is a religious purpose? You bet it does. If I can change your historical context, I can change the way you view the present. This is the power of historical revisionism. And that is why this tour is taking us to a place that is deeply critical, vitally critical. Now, this is not new. Historical revisionism is not new at all. There have been lies about history from the beginning. What was the first word out of the serpent's mouth? Did God really say? What is that statement? That was the statement about what?
The past.
The past. From the very beginning. There was a historical revisionist statement made about the past. Does that matter? Does it matter if we simply rewrite the history of the beginning? If we say, no, you are not made in the image of God. You're not imago Deo. You are really imago Gu. Does it make a difference? We've already looked at that difference, have we not? We've seen the impact of what happens when you simply rewrite that history. Well, there have been lies about the fall, Jesus' life, his death. But you know what? It did not take long for the lie concerning the resurrection of Jesus Christ to be under attack. Do you recall what occurred? Let me read this to you. Matthew chapter 28. At this moment, the women have already seen the risen Christ. Now, while the women were going, behold, some of the guard came into the city and reported to the chief priests all the things that had happened. Now, you recall the guard has witnessed something dramatic here. There's been an earthquake. This huge stone has been rolled away. They had been placed to guard the tomb, Roman guards, under the penalty of death, should anything happen. And they now go, which is interesting, they reported to the chief priests all the things that had happened. When they had assembled with the elders and consulted together, they gave a large sum of money to the soldiers, saying, tell them his disciples came at night and stole him away while we slept. And if this comes to the governor's ears, we will appease him and make you secure. So they took the money and did as they were instructed. And this saying is commonly reported among the Jews until this day. What was that?
Lie.
A lie, that's right. And by the way, what is a lie? Historical revisionism, is it not? Isn't that what a lie is? I didn't break the lamp, Mama. What are you doing? You're trying to rewrite history, if you did. And so here we have Matthew 28. The instruction to the guards was, go rewrite history. I know what you saw, but go rewrite history. And tell that historical revisionist narrative to all the people. So the idea of historical revisionism is not new. It began in the garden, and it continues today. Why? Because if you can rewrite the past, Oh, you can make people believe whatever you want in the present. In fact, it's very difficult to make anybody believe anything you want in the present without rewriting the history. This is a critical area. Now, Lena, do you believe in Plato?
Person Plato?
I don't mean believe in him like, we'd say believe in Jesus. I'm saying, do you believe that Plato lived?
I do.
Okay? Have you ever heard anyone who was laid awake at night wrestling with the question of whether or not Plato really ever existed? I've never heard anyone. Have you, Joshua?
No.
When I referenced Plato on our last tour, the tour before, or one of our tours, be honest with me, did anyone, when I mentioned Plato, did anyone say, I doubt that Plato ever lived? No. We'll accept that he lived. Correct? I have a book here, 5 Great Dialogues by Plato. I doubt that anyone opens these up and says, I don't know, I doubt that Plato ever really said this stuff. Why is it that the only book that ever comes under great attack in terms of whether or not it is really correct is this book here? I wonder why. We've already talked about why. But what I want you to do is to understand that even though this is under great attack from historical revisionist activists, we saw a film of the Jesus Seminar voting. You recall? What were they trying to do? Rewrite history. Now, I want you to understand that we have a huge amount of historical evidence that supports what we have and the historical document that the Scriptures gives to us. Look at the ancient works that exist today. And what I want you to do is compare the oldest manuscripts for each one. Let's look at one. For Homer's Iliad, the earliest manuscript we have, let's assume that Homer is writing his Iliad on this date. The oldest manuscript we have is one that was written 500 years after Homer wrote the Iliad in the beginning. You with me? Okay, Julius Caesar. The oldest manuscript we have is a document that was written 1,000 years after Caesar. That would be like saying what we are saying here today. The words that we're talking and speaking here today. 2,000 years from now, the only thing people have, the earliest thing that people have to find out whether or not we said what we said in here is a document that will be written 1,000 years from today. Are you with me? You follow me? Pliny's history, 750 years. 1,300 years, 1,300 years. Let's look at the New Testament. What do we have? 25 years. Only 25 years to the first and earliest document that we have. That's pretty significant. Let's look at another aspect. What about the number of manuscripts that we have? Let's go back to the same list. We have 643 manuscripts on Homer's Iliad. That's a lot. Julius Caesar, 10. Pliny's, 7. 8. What do we have with the New Testament? We have 5,000 Greek manuscripts. We have 19,000 manuscripts other than Greek. Over 24,000 manuscripts. When the Scripture, talking about the New Testament at this point, is laid aside all of the other ancient documents of which no one questions, we have manuscripts that are so close and so many compared to that. Why is it that you and I and the people around us are led to believe that you can't trust this to be historically accurate? There's a great deal of historical revisionism going on, and there's a reason for it. There is an objective behind that revisionism. Orwell, whom we would not normally quote, said, "He who controls the past controls the future." Marx understood the principle well. He said, "A people without a heritage are easily persuaded." Why? Because he knew that if you could come in and rewrite the history of a people, you could change what they believe in the present. See, God has given us a mandate to remember. Do you recall when the children of Israel were crossing the River Jordan? God gave a strange command to them. Do you recall what it was? The priests were still standing in the river, and God gave a command that one member of each tribe
Grab a stone.
was to go down into the river, pick up a stone, and do what with it? Pile it up on the other side of the River Jordan. Why, Joshua?
So they would remember what they went through.
They would remember. These were memorial stones that God had them build, piled up actually, so that when their children looked at them and said, "Papa, what are these stones here for?" Let me remind you of what God did for us. They were memorial stones. Well, how well did they do? All you have to do is turn to the next book. In Judges chapter 2, beginning in verse 6, we read this: that there arose a generation that knew not the Lord, nor what he had done. And it says they forgot him, and they began to turn then to all of the idols in the land. Let's use Isaiah 44 for a minute and say they turned and followed all the lies in the land. And the rest of the passage then says that God then raised up enemies from all around them. And when Israel went out to fight, the passage says they were defeated. And it ends up in verse 15 saying they were in great distress. Why? Because they had forgotten God. That's history. Now, God has given us a great deal of memorial stones. Your assignment can be to answer the question, why did God command the children of Israel to wear tassels? I'm not going to answer that on this tour. We'll do it later. The Passover Feast. Why was the Passover Feast instituted?
So that they would remember
To remember what?
God's deliverance.
God's deliverance. When those who were faithful to put the blood of the lamb on the lintels and the doorposts of their homes, according to the promise of God, the angel of death passed over them, and they were to observe that feast every year so that they would not forget what God had done. Virtually all of the feasts that God instituted were to remember, and they were to remember that providential act of God until the true Paschal Lamb came. You know what our problem is? Not only is our problem that we forget what we should remember, we keep remembering what we're supposed to forget. Isn't that surprising? What God tells us to forget. What does 1 Corinthians 13 say about love? That it keeps no records of wrongs. What does that mean? Forget it. What do? Remember it. Paul says, all those things I count as rubbish. What things was he saying that he counted as rubbish? All the things that he could boast in. Maybe we're supposed to forget all the stuff that we could boast in. We have a tendency to remember it. We have a tendency to forget the things we're supposed to remember and to remember the things we're supposed to forget. This issue of history is important. How important is it? Well, let's let a couple of our experts answer that for us.
The importance of knowing history is that one realizes that one is the recipient of a tradition. that the world didn't begin with oneself, nor will it end with oneself. Ignorance of history has the effect that people don't think even of their own lives in historical terms. Without history, nothing has any meaning. People don't understand that life is a biography, and they don't actually see that what they've done earlier in their lives has any impact on what happens to them afterwards.
We don't care about the past. History is bunk, as Henry Ford said, and many Christians have an abominable view of the past. If we look in the scriptures, there's a tremendous stress on remembering. It's one of the key words in the book of Deuteronomy. You remember the whole road you've come, because that's the source, one, of gratitude, two, of obedience.
Once I asked a young person when the Second World War was, and he thought for a time, and he said, well, the 18th century, and I was most impressed, actually. I thought that was a very good answer, because it meant he understood that there was a century other than the one in which he was living. Bear in mind, this is after 11 years of compulsory education. If you don't have a certain knowledge of history, then you can't understand anything, actually, about the modern world.
Where we've come from, the past and history, is the key to who we are and where we are. And those who don't know history have no sense of identity and no sense of wisdom as they explore where they're going to go. Without history, we're lost, both in terms of identity and in terms of the wisdom of the way we go forward.
It's interesting, when you begin to destroy any sense of belonging to any larger story, and it's all simply about you, then we lose any kind of connection with the answer to the question, what's the meaning of life? And when you ask that question, you get a sense that we really don't know if there's any meaning of life. Let's ask our friends.
What is the meaning of life? That's another big question.
What is the meaning of my life?
I don't know what the meaning of my life is.
What am I doing with my life? I know that. What is the meaning of it? Couldn't tell you.
The meaning of life, I think you need to break that down.
I don't know.
I don't know. Still lost right now.
Meaning of life, that's easy. That's an easy one. Philosophers throughout the ages have searched for the meaning of life, and the irony of it is that we so easily know the answer as Christians.
The meaning of life to me is to make my life worth something, to make decisions that, are about going to heaven.
I don't think there is a meaning of life.
Well, no, the meaning of life is immortality.
I believe the meaning of life, based around the premise that God's ultimate purpose is to glorify himself. So I believe as we live, we have to find that one thing or that couple of things that God has just clearly wired us for and offer it back to him and be the best we can be at it, and he will then use it for his glory.
Our purpose in life is to enjoy what he's given us and bring him as much glory as possible.
I know what I'm doing, but I couldn't tell you why. That's a philosophical question, and I'm not a philosopher.
Meaning of life, things being alive, I basically would think to be able to breathe and eat and, things like that.
I don't know what the meaning of life is. I think you just live your life and live it the way that you want to live it.
Between the time of birth and the time of death, here I am, here we are.
No regrets, just have a good time.
Generally speaking, I think the purpose, the meaning of life is to love and to be loved.
I think life is meant to be cherished and laughing and smiling, hanging out with people that you have a good time with.
Meaning for me is just, I have a purpose here and there's an end payoff. It's just not an accident.
And I'm kind of glad I don't know the meaning of life.
I've had a lot of discussions about this and I've come to the conclusion that there isn't a meaning to life, but I quite like that because that means that you can do anything, and if you do something that improves the world, that's great because that helps the people around. But if you just decide to live your life where you do things for yourself, then that's your life and it's over and you didn't waste it.
I believe that right here on earth, we can create heaven or create hell. And so I'm not that concerned about what happens after life. What I want to focus on is what am I helping to create here in this life.
Because once you're dead,
You get buried and you get eaten up by lots of little worms.
game over.
If the meaning of life really begins with you, the answer is pretty shallow. There's not much more you can say except you live and then you die, you get eaten by worms, game over. And I would submit to you that that comes from a disconnection with God's view of history. That's what we're trying to do. And that's why God gave us this mandate to remember. Let me look at Deuteronomy 8 with you for just a minute. This passage, I believe, is written for this culture just as it was written for them. When you have eaten and are satisfied, praise the Lord your God for the good land he has given you. Be careful that you do not forget the Lord your God, failing to observe his commandments, his laws, and decrees that I am giving you this day. Otherwise, when you eat and are satisfied, when you build fine houses and settle down, and when your herds and flocks grow large, and your silver and gold increase, and all you have is multiplied, then your heart would become proud, and you will forget the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. Now he's reminding them of his mighty deeds. You may say to yourself, my power and the strength of my hands have produced this wealth for me. But remember the Lord your God, for it is he who gives you the ability to produce wealth, and so confirms his covenant which he swore to your forefathers as it is today. If you ever forget the Lord your God and follow other gods, follow other lies, and worship and bow down to them, I testify against you today that you will surely be destroyed. Like the nations the Lord destroyed before you. Was the Lord providentially working in other nations before Israel? Yes. Like the nations the Lord destroyed before you, so you will be destroyed for not obeying the Lord your God. And lest we think that the destruction of a nation somehow comes bound up on the march of hobnailed boots through the land, let me remind you of Amos. There is coming a day, God says, when I will bring famine in the land, but it is not a famine of food and water. It's not a physical famine, not a physical destruction, but a famine of hearing the word of the Lord. A famine of hearing truth. Men will run to and fro looking for the word, looking for truth, but they will not find it. That is the picture of a nation that has been destroyed. And all we have to do is look around much of Western civilization today, and you will find nations that are destroyed. The light is removed. Forgetting, remembering, history, minor things? No. Major things. And that is why we see this huge battle over this area. And it rages around us. And what is the battle? Though we live in the world, we do not wage as the world does. Why? Because this battle is not over moats and castles. The weapons we fight with are not the weapons of the world. On the contrary, they have divine power to demolish strongholds. And what are those strongholds? We've looked at before. We demolish arguments and every pretension that does what? Sets itself up against the knowledge of God. This is that cosmic battle again. And we take captive every thought to make it